Good morning, dear students. Let me introduce you to my lecture, The Neural Pathways. The white matter is composed of a huge number of nervous fibers, or tracts. Association fibers, fibra associationes, connect cortical areas within the same cerebral hemisphere. Commissural fibers, fibra commissuralis, connect the corresponding areas in both hemispheres and enable coordinate function. Projection fibers, fibra projectiones, connect the cortex with the subcortical structure of the central nervous system. Association fibers, arcuate fibers, fibra arcuate cerebri. Short tracts interconnect neighboring gyri or areas in the same gyrus. Superior longitudinal fasciculus interconnect the frontal lobe with the parietal and occipital lobe. Inferior longitudinal fasciculus interconnect the occipital and temporal lobe. Arcuate fasciculus interconnect the Broca's area with Wernicke's area, which around the insular lobe, lies deeply in the hemisphere and interconnects the frontal and temporal lobe. Uncinate fasciculus, fasciculus uncinatus, interconnects the orbitofrontal cortex and temporal lobe. Vertical occipital fasciculus, fasciculi occipitalis verticalis, interconnect the posterior part of the parietal lobe with dorsal part of the temporal lobe. Transverse occipital fasciculus, fasciculi occipitalis horizontalis, situated inside the occipital lobe. Cingulum. Passes in the white matter of cingulate gyrus, interconnects the frontal and parietal lobe with the parahippocampal gyrus and with the adjacent part of the temporal lobe. Superior and inferior occipitofrontal fasciculus, fasciculus occipitofrontalis superior and inferior, interconnects the frontal lobe with the temporal and occipital lobe, is separate from the superior longitudinal fasciculus by the fibers of corona radiata, passes deep in the white substation adjacent to the caudate nucleus. In the picture, you can see all these fasciculus and fibers. Short fibers interconnect neighboring gyri or areas in the same gyrus. Superior longitudinal fasciculus interconnect the frontal lobe with the parietal and occipital lobe. Uncinate fasciculus interconnects or orbitofrontal cortex and temporal lobe. Cingulum interconnects the frontal and parietal lobe with the parahypocal gyrus and with the adjacent part of temporal lobe. Inferior longitudinal fasciculus interconnect the occipital and temporal lobe. In this picture, you can see three types of the neural pathways. Fibra arcuate, fibra commissurale, and fibra proyectionis. Commissural fibers corpus callosum interconnects the neocortical gyri of both hemispheres, a large fasciculus or bidirectional tract. Parts in the sagittal section: rostrum, genum, truncus, splenium. Parts in the cross section: minor or frontal forceps, major or occipital forceps. Anterior commissura, commissura anterior, consists of two parts: anterior part or olfactory commissure, commissural paleocortex, and posterior part or commissure of neocortex. Posterior part interconnects the temporal lobes. Commissura fornix, commissura fornicis, interconnects the right and left fornix. Is commissure of archaeocortex. Habenular commissura, commissura habenularum, interconnects the two habenula to the pineal gland. Posterior or epithalamic commissura, commissura epithalamica posterior. Anterior commissure, corpus callosum, projection fibers of internal capsule. Projection fibers subdivide into two types: short projection fibers and long projection fibers. Long projection fibers are extending or sensory and distending or motor tracts. Let's remember anatomy of a neuron. Each neuron contains cell body with nucleus, dendrites, fibers that receive message from other neurons, and axons, fibers that send message to other neurons. Neurons do not touch. There is a gap between them called a synapse. Messages are sent across the synapses by special chemicals called neurotransmitters. Classification receptors by location. exteroceptors respond to stimuli arising outside the body. A receptor in the skin for touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Most special sense organs. Interoceptors, visoreceptors respond to stimuli arising in internal viscera and blood vessels. Sensitive to chemical changes, tissue stage, and temperature changes. Proprioceptors respond to stretch in skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, connective tissue, covering of bones and muscles. Informs the brain of one's movements. Classification of the ascending pathways. The proprioceptive pathway, the pathway of deep sensitivity, transmits the signals from the muscles, the fascia, the joints, and the periosteum from the locomotor apparatus. And we have the proprioceptive pathway to the cerebral cortex, the proprioceptive pathway to the cerebellum. The exteroceptive pathways transmit the impulse from the skin receptors, skin sensitivity, the retina, the visual sensitivity, the internal ear, auditory sensitivity, and the tongue papilla, taste sensitivity. Organization of a reflex pathway. You can see sensory receptor, response to stimulus by producing generator or receptor potential. Sensory neuron axon conduct impulses from receptor to integrating center. Association neuron and integrating center, one or more regions within the central nervous system that relay impulse from sensory to motor neurons. Motor neuron axon conduct impulse from integrating center to effector. Effector, muscles or gland that responds to motor nerve impulse. In the picture you can see ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord. Sensory tracts and motor tracts. Primary afferent neuron, the first neuron in a spinal reflex or ascending spinal pathway. Primary afferent neurons have the unipolar cell bodies in spinal ganglia. In general, pathways may be categorized into three broad functional types. First type, or conscious discrimination on localization breaking pain, warmth, cold, discriminative touch, kinesthesia. Requires a specific extending spinal pathway to the contralateral thalamus, which in turn sends an external projection to the cerebral cortex. Generally, there are three neurons in the conscious pathway, and the axon of the projection neuron decussate and joins a contralateral tract. Effects relate emotional and alerting behavior. Information involves extending spinal pathway to the brainstem. Projection neurons are non-specific. Subconscious sensory feedback for posterior movement. Control involves extending spinal pathway principally to the cerebellum or brainstem nuclei that project to the cerebellum. White matter contains bundles of fasciculi or fibers that occupy more or less definite position in the white matter. They have the same origin, termination, and carry the same function. They are classified into short tracts or intersegmental or rubrospinal. Fibers occupy narrow band peripheral to the gray matter, fasciculus propers. They interconnect adjacent or distant spinal segments and permit intersegmental coordination. Long tracts contains ascending, sensory or afferent, and descending, motor or efferent. They serve to join the brain to the spinal cord. Ascending tracts carry impulse from pain, thermal, tactile, muscle and joint receptors to the brain. Some of this information eventually reaches a conscious level, the cerebral cortex, while some is destined for subconscious center, the cerebellum. Pathways that carry information to a conscious level share certain common characteristics. There is a sequence of three neurons between the peripheral receptors and the cerebral cortex. Last neuron is located in cerebral cortex. The first order neuron, or primary afferent neuron, enters the spinal cord to the dorsal root of a spinal nerve and its cell body lies in the dorsal root spinal ganglion. The main fiber remains on the ipsilateral side of the cord and terminates in synaptic contact with the second neuron, which lies either in the spinal gray matter or in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. The axon of the second order neuron crosses over decussate to the opposite side of the central nervous system and ascends to the thalamus where it terminates. The third order neuron has its cell body in the thalamus. Its axon passes to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. Three major pathways carry sensory information. Posterior column contains gracile epinnate fasciculi. Anterolateral pathway, spinothalamic, and spinocerebellar pathway. Fasciculus gracilis et cuneatus carry impulse concentrate with proprioception and discriminative touch. From ipsilateral side of the body contains the axons of primary afferent neurons that have entered cord to dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. Fasciculus gracilis contains fibers sealed sacral, lumbar, and lower thoracic levels. Fasciculus cuneatus contains fiber received at upper thoracic and cervical levels. Fibers ascend without interruption where they terminate upon second-order neurons in nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. The axons of the second-order neurons decussate in the medulla as internal arcuate fibers and ascend to the brainstem as medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus terminates in the ventral-posterior nucleus of the thalamus. Third-order neurons, which project to the somatosensory cortex, thalamocortical fibers. Spinothalamic tracts, located lateral and ventral to the ventral column, carry impulses concerned with pain and thermal sensations, lateral tract, and non-discriminative touch and pressure, anterior tract. In brainstem constitutes the spinal lemniscus. Information is sent to the primary sensory cortex on the opposite side of the body. Lateral spinothalamic tract. Function. Carries pain and temperature to thalamus and sensory area of the cerebral cortex. Contains 3 neurons. Neuron number 1, small sensory pseudounipolar cell in the dorsal root spinal ganglia. Neuron number 2 are cells of substantia gelatinosa in the posterior horn. Neuron number 3 are cells of nucleus of the thalamus. The spinothalamic tract contains second-order neurons, the cell bodies of which lie in the contralateral dorsal horn. Anterior spinothalamic tract function carries fluid, touch, and pressure to thalamus and sensory cortex. Contains 3 neurons. Neuron number 1, medium-sized cells in the dorsal spinal ganglia. Neuron number 2 are cells of main sensory nucleus or nucleus proprius. Neuron number 3 are cells nucleus of thalamus. Effect of lesion. Loss or crude touch sensation below the level of the lesion. Spinocerebellar tracts. The spinocerebellar system consists of a sequence of 2 neurons. Neuron number 1 are large cells or dorsal spinal ganglia. Neuron number 2 are cells of the nucleus of posterior horn. Located near the dorsolateral and ventrolateral surface of the cord, contain axons of the second-order neurons. Carry information derived from muscle, spindles, Golgi tendon, organs, and tactile receptors to the cerebellum. For the control of posture and coordination of movements. Posterior spinocerebellar tract. Present only above level third lumbar vertebra. The cell bodies of second-order neuron lie in thoracic nucleus. Axons of second-order neuron terminate ipsilaterally, uncrossed, in the cerebral cortex by entering through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Posterior spinocerebellar tract conveys sensory information to the same side of the cerebellum. The cell bodies of second-order neuron lie in base of the dorsal horn of the lumbosacral segments. Intermediate medial nucleus. Axons of second-order neuron cross to opposite side, extend as far as the midbrain, and then make a sharp turn caudally and enter the superior cerebellar peduncle. The fibers cross the midline for a second time within the cerebellum before terminating in the cerebellar cortex. Ventral spinocerebellar tract conveys sensory information to the same side of the cerebellum. Spinothalamic tract. Extend in the anterolateral part, in close association with spinothalamic system. Primary efferents reach dorsal horn to dorsal roots and terminate on second-order neurons. The cell bodies of second-order neuron lie in base of the dorsal horn. Axons of second-order neuron cross the opposite side and project to the paraqueductal gray matter and superior colliculus in the midbrain. Involved in reflexive turning of the head and eyes toward a point of cutaneous stimulation. Spino-olivary tract. Indirect spinocerebellar pathway, spino-olivocerebellar. Impulses from the spinal cord are relayed to the cerebellum via inferior olivary nucleus. Conveys sensory information to the cerebellum. Fibers arise at all levels of the spinal cord. contribute to movement coordination associated primarily with balance. Spino-reticular tract originates in lamina from number 4 to number 8. Contains uncrossed fibers that end in medullary reticular formation. Crossed and uncrossed fibers that terminate in pontine reticular formation. Forms part of the ascending reticular activating system. Involved in arousing consciousness in the reticular activating system through cutaneous stimulation. Trigeminal tract. First neuron resides within trigeminal ganglion. Second neuron resides within the nucleus or trigeminal nerve. Nucleus spinalis or nucleus spontaneous or nucleus mesencephalicus. The axons of the cell pitudiculate and join the lateral spinothalamic tract to reach the thalamus, the ventrolateral nucleus. It comprises set neurons. The axons of the set neurons pass through the posterior limb of internal capsule and reach the inferior portion of the postcentral gyrus or precentral gyrus. Descending spinal pathways. The motor pathways comprise two systems of descending fibers. The pyramidal system that conduct voluntary motor impulse from the cerebral cortex, and the extrapyramidal system that deals with the basal nuclei. The pyramidal fibers conduct the impulses from well-coordinated, stated voluntary movements. The system is represented with the pyramidal fasciculus subdivided into the corticonuclear fibers and the corticospinal fibers. The extrapyramidal system ensures adequate muscle tonus and turning of the motor apparatus. It automatically sets the muscles to the ground earth mode necessary for fast, highly differentiated movements specified by the pyramidal system. The extrapyramidal system acts in concert with the pyramidal system. Both systems constitute a single fold. The pyramidal tracts, corticospinal tract, tractus corticospinalis, subdivide the lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract, and corticonuclear tract or tractus corticonuclearis. The extrapyramidal tracts contain tractus cortico-pontocerebello-dentato rubro, reticulo vestibulo olevo spinalis, tractus cortico-talamo-striato striato pallido rubro, reticulo o vestibulo olevo spinalis, vestibulo spinalis, tractus reticulo spinalis, tractus tectus spinalis, tractus rubrospinalis, and tractus olevo spinalis. Corticospinal tract travels from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord. Corticospinal tract actually consists of two separate tracts in the spinal cord, the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. Contains mostly motor axons. Referred to as a pyramidal tract as when the tract passes the medulla, it forms a dense bundle of nerve fibers that is shaped somewhat like a pyramid. First neurons are in gigantic pyramidal cells or beds situated in the precentral gyrus and the paracentral lobe, the motor area. The axons of the cells form the pyramidal fasciculus that passes through the genu and the anterior portion of the internal capsule and descend to the brainstem and the spinal cord. The larger portion of the fibers descend to the pyramids of the medulla oblongata as the corticospinal fibers. On reaching the spinal cord, about 40% of the fibers decussate, the decussation of pyramids, and enter the lateral funiculus to form the lateral corticospinal tract. The rest of fibers proceed to the anterior funiculus directly to form the anterior corticospinal tract. The fibers of both tracts enter each segment separately. The fibers of the anterior corticospinal tract decussate as they reach the destination point. Corticonuclear tract. First nerve are in gigantic pyramidal cells or beds situated in the precentral gyrus and the paracentral lobe, the motor areas. The axons of cells form the pyramidal fasciculus that passes through the genu and the anterior portion of the internal capsule and descend to the brainstem and the spinal cord. Some fibers decussate yet in the brainstem and terminate on the motor nucleus of the cranial nerves that reside within the midbrain, the third and the fourth pairs within the pons, the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth pairs, and within the medulla oblongata, the ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th pairs. Cortico-pontocerebello-dentato Rubrospinal Tract. First neuron of this chain are the pyramidal cells located in the cortex. The axons of the cells that passes through the corona radiata, white matter of cerebral hemisphere, internal capsule, and the base of pedunculus cerebri to the pulsar part of the pons, where second neuron nucleus continues. The axon second neurons form decussation and reach the middle cerebellar pedunculus, travels to the cerebellum. The third neuron is in cerebellar cortex. The fourth neuron also is located in cerebellum, but is in the dentate nucleus. The axon's fourth neurons passes to superior cerebellar pedunculus to the midbrain, form decussation, decussatio pedunculorum cerebellarum superiorum. The fifth neuron, situated in the red nucleus, or nucleus rubra, or olera, or vestibular nucleus, the axon travels on opposite side and form decussation, or decussatio tegmenti ventralis, and descend to the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. The sixth neuron is located in motor nucleus of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Tractus cortico-thalamus-striato-striato pallido-rubrospinalis. First neurons of this chain are the pyramidal cells located in the cortex. The axons of the cells that passes through the corona radiata, white matter of the cerebral hemisphere, internal capsule to the diencephalon, thalamus, where is second neuron. The third neuron is in small cells of the striatum. The fourth neuron is in big cells of the striatum. The fifth neuron situated in the globus pallidus. The sixth neurons are in red nucleus, nucleus rubra, or oliva, or vestibular nuclear or reticular formation. The axons travels on opposite side and form decussation, decussatio tegmenti ventralis, and descend to the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. The seventh neuron is located in motor nucleus of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Fasciculus longitudinalis medialis. First neuron are in the posterior or epithalamic commissure, Darkshevich nuclei. The axons form incomplete decussation and run to the nuclei number 3, 4, 6 pairs and vestibular nuclei of the cranial nerves. Second neurons are vestibular nuclei and nuclei number 3 and number 4, 6 pairs. The axon descends to anterior funiculus to the spinal cord. Third neuron situated in motor nucleus of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Rubrospinal tract travels from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord via the red nucleus and extrapyramidal motor tract. Its main role is in mediation of voluntary movements. It is responsible for large muscle movements, such as the arms and the legs, as well as for fine motor control. It facilitates the flexion and inhibits the extension in the upper extremities. Reticulospinal tract, an extrapyramidal motor tract which travels from the reticular formation. The tract is divided into two parts, the medial or pontine and lateral or medullary reticulospinal tract. Integrates information from the motor system to coordinate automatic movements of locomotion and posture. Facilitates and inhibits voluntary movement. Infants muscles down. Vestibulospinal tract. Inputs originate from the labyrinth system via the vestibular nerve and from the cerebellum. The medial part of the vestibulospinal tract projects bilaterally down the spinal cord and triggers the cervicospinal circuits, controlling a correct position of the head and neck. The lateral part of the vestibulospinal tract projects ipsilateral down to the lumbar region. There it helps to maintain an upright and balanced posture by stimulating extensor motor neurons in the legs. And olivospinal tract. You can see inferior olivar nucleus, very important nucleus for this tract, and the axonous nucleus around to the spinal cord. Olivospinal tract in anterior right cone of spinal cord. Thank you. Goodbye.